Now, yesterday, On the Money posed the question, will Boris's tax rises kill the UK's post-COVID economic recovery? Well, it turns out we were wrong, because the British economy has already stalled. New figures this morning point to GDP growth of just 0.1% in July. That was way below market expectations and sharply down from 1% growth in June, even though July, remember, was when England's remaining lockdown restrictions were almost entirely eased. Yes, July did mark the UK's sixth consecutive month of economic expansion, but with 0.1% growth, it was only just. And we're meant to be in the midst of a sharp V-shaped recovery, powering our way out of this pandemic. The British economy, though, is still 2.1% smaller, these new figures show, than its pre-pandemic peak. US GDP, in contrast, has now fully recovered, with America's economy now bigger than before the pandemic. And the same holds true in Germany too. What seemed to happen in July is that the UK's pingdemic kept millions of workers at home across manufacturing, the service sector and beyond. On top of that, though, there's a more fundamental problem, with supply chain shortages and inflation now becoming ingrained as firms struggle with rising input costs for steel, energy, labour or whatever else. These realities, it seems, are now seriously hitting our economic output. UK car production, for instance, hit its lowest level in July since the Suez Crisis in 1956, with factories stymied by a global shortage of microchips as well as staff absences. Manufacturers are suffering from a shortage not just of inputs, but skilled labour in particular, as business leaders so often point out. Let's remember, despite current difficulties, the UK remains a leading manufacturer, with the 9th biggest on earth, with the sector employing more than 3 million people in this country, generally in well-paid jobs. British manufacturing remains in places world-class, and that's why I'm posing the question I am today. As the economy stalls with GDP figures flat, can British manufacturing rescue the UK economy? Joining me now to discuss this issue is a very eminent economist, an old friend of mine, Vicky Price. She formerly ran the government's economic service, making her one of Whitehall's most senior economists, and now she's Chief Economic Advisor at the Centre for Economics and Business Research. Welcome to you, Vicky. I'm also delighted to be joined by the manufacturing legend that is John Elliott. He's the founder of EBAC. That's a family-owned British company with a factory in County Durham. He ships UK-made washing machines, freezers, dehumidifiers, water coolers, and much more around the world to destinations including the US, France, Germany, Spain, South Africa, and beyond. Really good to have you both with me in the studio for this discussion. We put proper time aside, as we do on the money, to talk to people with genuine experience and expertise. Before we get going, Vicky and John, let me just detail those GDP figures that came out this morning. So we had GDP growth of 0.1% in July, month on month. We then had the Reuters forecast was 0.6%. That's what economists thought would happen. Dismal scientists getting it wrong again. Manufacturing itself was what Gordon Brown once called 0% growth, completely flat compared to the month before in July. The service sector, almost 80% of the UK economy, that actually contracted by 0.3% month on month. Retail sales fell by 2.5% during July, perhaps because when those COVID restrictions lifted, people stopped shopping online and actually went outside and did things. And even construction down 1.6%. That's the 4th successive month that construction has fallen. That sector really hindered by very, very expensive input costs, not just labour, but timber, all kinds of other things. So, Vicky, great to have you with me. Let's put that to you. When the GDP figure came out this morning, I know you will have been up early watching the number come out, as I was, nerds that we are. Were you surprised?
I was surprised it was as low as that, because, as you rightly said, most economists expected there would be a reasonable improvement, because, of course, we had the easing of the restrictions. So the service sector in particular was expected to have done really well. And we had already seen retail increasing a little bit and so on. But actually in July wasn't anything like as good as that. But there are bits in between which have done well, even within services. So travel, people realised they can actually go abroad. So, and of course, there were also the staycations, whatever it is that
That's
we call
right.
it, basically staying in the UK. So all that area did well. And also arts and entertainment, because finally they were allowed to open up. And that made a big difference too. But overall, the service sector itself, which had begun to take over from manufacturing as the main engine of growth, really stalled, which was disappointing.
I must say, Vicky, before we come to John, I was sort of patting myself on the back in recent months, having predicted a V-shaped recovery myself. It seems now we really can't take this recovery for granted, can we? The economy is stalling. Wouldn't you say? I mean, the economy seems to be stalling.
I'm so sorry. I didn't realise you were asking me. But yes, absolutely. But it's interesting because, of course, you started with a manufacturing story and how important this has been. The truth is that it has been manufacturing for quite some time, which has engineered this growth in the economy that we have seen. Because if you remember, at the first lockdown, manufacturing and construction were shut down. Basically, nobody was going to work. And nothing actually was happening at all, and manufacturing closed. From about July 2020, manufacturing and construction started recovering very significantly, and they have been, until very recently, you've seen the construction data, they have been on an upward trend, and manufacturing has been positive every month, even though that slowed down significantly, every month since then. Without that improvement in manufacturing, which of course reflected growth in trade more generally across the world, demand for various things for down the supply chain and so on, if we hadn't had that manufacturing growth over that period, as the rest of the world was actually recovering, China, the US, as you rightly said, then we would have been in a much worse position. So the question is, can we still rely on manufacturing to take us through the next phase? And the problems are, just as you're saying, shortages of labour, and also across the world, input costs going up, and real shortages. Semiconductors, for example, are a main thing. Steel, difficult to get. Copper prices having risen, and of course, at the same time, oil prices going up very significantly. Indeed.
Now, John Elliott, great you can join us. You run EBAC up there in Newton Aycliffe in County Durham. You've been a manufacturer all your working life since you left school at 16. Do you think manufacturing can rescue the UK economy?
I left school at 15. I didn't waste another year. I got out to work as soon as I could. Look, I would say that you're right. EBAC's been around 50 years next February, and I've never known it quite as difficult as this for such a long period, for all kinds of reasons. But can I just throw a spanner in the works?
Yeah.
I think GDP is a poor measurement for the economy overall.
Yeah.
I'm much more concerned about deficits. And another thing I believe in, which might surprise you, industry is here to serve people, not the other way around. Sometimes we think that people go out and spend money to buy things they don't need, and sometimes can't afford, just to get growth in manufacturing or in business. And in my opinion, that's the wrong message.
I think we can see some pictures here of your EBAC factory, John. You're a big employer in Newton Aycliffe. You've got a lot of experience. You employ a couple of hundred people there making all kinds of heat pumps, washing machines, dehumidifiers and so on for exports. I know you're a formidable businessman, but are you suffering from supply chain shortages as well? Are you suffering from this inflation of input prices that we're seeing coming through, not so much in the consumer inflation data yet, but in the kind of wholesale inflation data?
I think average is very dangerous, actually. The biggest cost we've got is actually containers. We've got a shipment manufactured today, which we can't ship to the USA till October because we can't get a container. And even then, it's going to cost 3 times more than it did a year ago. And that's just a temporary. That's not caused by supply and demand. That's just either people are manipulating it for their own benefits, which could be true, or it's a supply. It's some kind of confusion or misalignment. But those are the things. Plastic has increased. That's coming down. What happens when there's a shortage? Everybody over-orders, right? And then they get the delivery, and then they cancel the order they put in. And so it will eventually sort itself out. Yeah. There isn't that much more demand, so it's small. But it can be a nuisance, and it's been difficult for the last 2 years for all kinds of reasons. People off work because of the pandemic, people being pinged. It's difficult to recruit staff now, even though apparently there's people around, but no one wants to work, and that's not quite true. But it's just been difficult generally. But we get over it. It'll work itself out. But I really do think we've got to stop measuring GDP, because GDP measures what we spend, not what we produce. If we do pointless things like putting silly signs on the road that don't work, that increases GDP. doesn't add any wealth to the economy at all.
Vicky, you're very plugged in with the UK policy-making establishment, the Whitehall, the Bank of England, and so on. What do you think the Bank of England will think of these numbers this morning? Really quite surprising numbers on GDP. Will that impact how the MPC thinks about whether or not it should raise interest rates in the coming months?
I think it will, because, of course, the worry had been about inflation. Of course, we've seen not just in the UK, but everywhere else, inflation going up, partly because of the reasons we've just been discussing. And the question had been whether it's temporary or not. And because there had been some very optimistic forecasts about the UK economy, those, of course, go hand in hand with high inflation. And you need to do perhaps something about this. Now, this latest data that's just come out would suggest that perhaps those pressures aren't going to be that great. The real concern still that everyone has is those supply shortages, those staff shortages as well. Are they going to be eased when the furlough scheme comes to an end at the end of this month?
End of this month, that's right.
Absolutely. And are we therefore going to see quite a big influx of people, willing to do various things? But of course, many won't be trained in manufacturing and the skills that are needed, for example, in particular areas. And also, they may be in the wrong part of the country. So how do you move them across? So how do you train them? How do you move into that? So it's quite likely that those shortages will remain for some time to come.
All of us on this discussion, I think it's fair to say, if not all of our viewers, will remember the 70s, even if we were just kids in the 70s. You just said there, GDP isn't growing, it's quite flat, so that means inflation might not be as powerful as we thought it might be. Or we could have what we call stagflation, right, where you get low GDP, even falling GDP, and inflation as well. That surely has to be a danger now.
Of course, there is what we call stagflation, which is exactly what may indeed happen. But what you're already seeing is that in some areas, those pressures, those inflation pressures, are easing. And I think we need to bear in mind that the reason why we're having those shortages at present, and of course container costs have gone up very significantly too, taking advantage of whatever has been going on, is that loads of manufacturing companies just cancelled their orders that they had made at the beginning of the pandemic. And of course, the factories that were making them just closed down, or they were hit themselves, of course, by COVID issues, and they have continued to be hit. And when everyone starts asking for those products, particularly for cars, electric cars, we're all becoming considerably more climate conscious, then it's inevitable those pressures will be out there.
That's right.
Now, the question is, how quickly can those organisations respond to this?
Can the supply side respond to the demand side?
And then can it get to where you want it?
That's
that's the other thing in terms of transport. So the inflation picture is finely balanced at present.
It does seem that the global economy, the British economy, John, is trying to kind of reboot. It was discombobulated by lockdown, and we're trying to get our supply side back up and running. Of course, a big input cost for manufacturers a lot of the time is labour, particularly skilled labour. We've got almost 1 million job vacancies across the UK economy now. Still quite a lot of workers on the furlough scheme. They may not all keep their jobs when that ends at the end of September. So there could be more workers coming to the market, as Vicky just said. But tell me about the skills side. I know EBAC's got a real tradition of training up local men and women to work in your factories. But would you say that the British economy's got the same kind of skills prowess that it had when you left school at 15?
Absolutely. Our recruitment methodology is this. We look for attitude, skills and knowledge. The main one is attitude. If we get people with the right attitude, we'll train them the skills and give them the knowledge. So the skills and knowledge in manufacturing, we can take care of that. We want people with the right attitude, the attitude that they want to work.
And what do you think we should be? You are pretty sceptical about conventional education, I know from talking to you in the past. What would you like to see? What do you think when you see 50% of kids going to university? What do you think when you get business leaders saying we need more apprenticeships, we need more skilled vocational training in this country? We've been saying this for years, haven't we, John? How can we actually make it happen?
It's all sexy, you see, the university, going to uni. And then but now we're saying apprentices. Most workers in factories don't even need apprenticeships. They need to want to work, they're prepared to learn some basic skills. If I was in charge of things, and I'm not, I would get rid of the education department and I'd have a child development department, which takes care of children from birth to adulthood and looks at the individual needs of people. And it's different for each child. A lot of people now in school, a 15-year-old, would be better off leaving school, going to work, they'll develop better, they'll learn some skills, they'll actually earn some money, help our economy, and they don't need to have A-levels. Most people in the factories, and working generally, building sites, all of those things that we need to make our lives good, you don't need A-levels. You don't need to know when Queen Victoria died or do quadratic equations. You need to be able to read and write and use basic numbers and be prepared to learn and work.
And you need vocational skills. And to what extent should businesses be encouraged by government, even incentivised by government, to impart those skills on workers?
No, we don't need any. There's all these funny games going on where people are making money out of getting apprenticeships. It's become another business in itself. I get people ringing up saying, can you take some apprentices? And they offer us cash to take them. If we develop our industrial manufacturing, we would demand apprentices. We would pull them in rather than be pushed in. They're pushed into jobs that don't exist. We've got to start by encouraging investment in manufacturing. We will then create those jobs and pull in the right people instead of bringing in people through mechanisms that have nothing to do with reality.
OK, John, hold that thought, Vicky. We're going to carry on this discussion over the break. You're watching On the Money with me, Liam Halligan. We're discussing, can British manufacturing rescue the UK economy? Your emails are flooding in thick and fast. We'll be reading out some of those. We'll be back after the weather. Stay with us. You're On the Money.